The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
7 reasons why I don't believe in God. Number 1, not enough evidence. If God were real and wanted me to know, wouldn't he provide better evidence than what we have? Look at the trees isn't good enough for me. Number 2, indoctrination. Most people on earth believe the same way that their parents do or the people around them do. Number 3, I can't make myself believe. We don't choose our beliefs. We either believe something or we don't, and I can't make myself believe no matter how many people tell me that I need to. Number 4, there are some truly awful things in this world. Why would a God allow world hunger and terminal illness in children if he's supposed to be good? Number 5, intelligent design is not so intelligent. Over 99% of the species who have ever lived on Earth are now extinct. Number 6, the Bible. If the Bible were the Word of God, wouldn't he make it more reliable? Wouldn't the Gospels have been written during Jesus' lifetime? And number 7, science. We learn more about the universe every day, and the God of the gaps is shrinking.
Me and Josh were absolutely jealous of your setup. We just want to look as cool as you do.
Well, what's been really cool about being here at Blacksburg is they want to dovetail apologetics with the campus ministry. Yeah. And so one of the things that I said is like, listen, I'm actually building an 8-year plan right now for Virginia Tech and the campus ministry. And one of the things that, I told them is like, listen, if I'm going to be here and I'm going to do campus work, we have to have a social media plan. We have to have a social media platform. And, I don't have the resources to get what I need. And they were just like, get whatever you need.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I'm like even like for my office, they're like, I went in there and I said, hey, I got this little small room, what's my budget for my office? And they're like, you don't have one, get whatever you need.
Man, that's awesome.
I'm like, what?
I'm like,
what? Yeah. I'm like, yeah, I still don't have my second shelf up, but I need to paint the room. It's like a yellowish color. I need to paint it like gray or something like that. But
there you go.
They've been super kind.
Yeah, that's
with
awesome.
What they've done.
Yeah,
and
so
awesome
when churches can
like
really get
we're building out a plan
really.
where every semester is every spring semester is an apologetics topic. Yeah. And then for their spring break, we go on what we call immersion week, where we're going to go to a particular place domestically and engage with people that don't think like us. So
that's awesome.
So next spring, we'll do apologetics, and then we'll go to Austin, Texas, and I'm in the process of talking to some people down there who are atheists.
Nice.
About coming in and just having a conversation.
Yeah, that's awesome.
The group interacting, then we debrief. And so we'll do that this year or next year. And then the year after that, 2024, we're going to do Mormonism. We're going to go out to Utah and we're going to talk to Mormons. And then the year after that, we're going to do Islam, and we're going to go up to New York, and we're going to, travel to different mosques and just sit, listen, have conversations, talk, and engage. That way, by the time the students get out of tech, they've been on 4 domestic, what I call intellectual mission trips, and they've been on at least 2 international mission trips. Man, so they become well-rounded.
That is incredibly awesome, because that's something that I think a lot of grown Christians are somewhat, I'll say, I think are somewhat scared to do. And legit. Now, granted, logistically that can be difficult to plan out. For the next 4 years, I'm going to spend a week in Austin and New York and Utah and whatever.
That's why I have a request for an increased budget
that makes a lot of sense
that done. But no, I told them about the idea, and they're like, put it together and let's do it.
That's fantastic.
So, they've been really good. So
yeah, that's awesome. I'm super
I think
excited.
It makes it easier for them to say yes, because they know I've got a master's in apologetics. So it's not like, you're sending somebody with them that doesn't know what to do.
Right.
So
That's awesome.
And I'm going to rope in some guys from the Daily Apologist to come with us
For
in Austin
sure. I
as
was
well.
about to say, I expect tons and tons of content videos from those particular trips.
Yeah,
So
we'll see how that goes. That'd be really cool.
that'll be
So,
awesome. Anyway, so as we use that as a segue into what is now part 2 of episode 10. So we started out on episode 10 with the intent of doing this whole video from a guy that if you haven't watched the first part, by the way, it's up. Go back and watch that so you kind of know what we're talking about. We're following this guy called Jesus Unfollower, is what he calls himself. Really popular TikTok atheist, and he gave 7 reasons as to why he no longer believes in God. Grew up a Christian in the southern part of the United States. I haven't ever been able to find a video where he talks about where he grew up specifically, but he grew up in the South. Grew up as a Christian and now is an atheist. And he gave 7 reasons as to why he no longer believes in God. And we said, you know what, we're going to tackle all 7 of these in one video. And I think like halfway through, we're like, yeah, this was a bad idea. So this is a 2-parter. We have on obviously myself, Joshua, and Dean, who is 1/5, 1/6 of the Daily Apologist, something along those lines. Campus minister at the Blacksburg Church of Christ over at Virginia Tech. So super excited to have you on again. Like I said, if you haven't watched part 1, go back, watch part 1 so you kind of know what we're talking about. We covered his top 3.5 is what I'm going to call it, his top 3.5 reasons. He claimed that there was not enough evidence to support the idea that God exists, and we briefly mentioned stuff like the fine-tuning argument. I think Dean's favorite was the Kalam cosmological argument. If I'm saying
Stay
that,
calm and Kalam.
There you go. So we talked about that. We talked about his number 2 reason was the idea that of indoctrination, is the fact that a different video, I think he mentioned that nearly 90% of everybody in the world believes just whatever their parents believe, whatever their parents taught them. And then he also talked about how he can't make himself believe, right? He gets a lot of Christians saying, well, just believe, just have faith. You can't force yourself to believe something that isn't true. And I think we made the argument that we're not asking you to force yourself to believe. We're just asking, which is a more rational, logical side to be on. And we kind of touched on, which we're going to start today, point number 4. So if you haven't watched the first part, again, real quick, go back, do that, because we're going to start with point number 4, and you're going to miss a lot if you don't go back and watch part 1. Point number 4 he made was that there was too much evil and suffering in the world in order to believe that there was a God. And I think in the last video I made the comment that if the atheists were going to make one, what I believe to be viable argument, in a sense, viable argument, if you were going to pick an argument that was going to make the most emotional sense for sure, I think you start with the problem of human pain and suffering and evil. The idea that there's a God who is all good, all powerful, but evil exists. So either evil exists and God can remove it, and doesn't, meaning he's not all good, or he can't remove it, and so therefore he's not all powerful. And I think that's kind of the train of thought that a lot of atheists work their way down, is you can't have an all powerful and all good God and evil exists. And so just want to get y'all's initial thoughts on that. Like I said, I think that's I'm not going to say it's a go-to. And we talked about before we started recording how Dean said you kind of break up atheists into like the Facebook atheist and the more logical academic atheist, I guess is what you said. But both tend to point to an argument kind of like this.
Yeah, they do. And as we said last time, first, thanks for having me back again. I'm extremely honored to be back and have this conversation with you guys. And so, yeah, I mean, the newest Barna poll out about Gen Z, the number 1 reason why they leave church is because of the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. So you are correct. It is a go-to by both the intellectual and the popularizers in the atheist community. And so when we talk about the problem of evil, there's really 2 big pieces to it. There's the intellectual side of it, and then there's the emotional side of it. And what you were hitting on earlier, Nathan, was the intellectual side of it. And you've got it completely right. The way that it goes is if an all-loving, powerful God exists, evil does not exist, evil exists, and then therefore an all-loving, all-powerful God does not exist. And so really what this is designed to do is to put the theist in kind of a pickle, in a corner. Either they have to say one of three things. God exists, but he's extremely immoral. Evil does not exist, or God does not exist. That's what it's designed to do. And so I don't think anybody in the theist camp is going to say that evil doesn't exist. I think we would recognize that evil exists. So now we've got two options. Either God exists and he's just immoral, or he doesn't exist. And so the unprepared layperson is probably going to struggle with that. But I think there is a third option, is that God exists and he has good moral grounds for allowing the evil, pain, and suffering that we see in the world. So the first thing that I want to do, and I've got some notes here that, as I've thought about this some more, the first thing that I want to mention, there's no clear cut contradiction between God existing and evil existing. It's not the same as, say, like a married bachelor, right? If you are following there, to be married is to not be a bachelor, and to be a bachelor is to not be married. Well, that's not the same as God existing and evil not existing. Those two things could definitely logically coexist. Okay, so it's not an explicit contradiction. So what does that mean? It means that there are some assumptions that the atheist is making, and we touched on a couple of these just briefly last time we got together. And so the first assumption is that if God is all powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. All right. And then the second assumption is that if God is all loving, then he prefers a world without suffering. All right. And so in order for this argument to hold, at least the logical argument, in order for it to hold, both of these hidden assumptions must be true. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you guys, is just go ahead and briefly look at the first assumption and the second assumption. Is that cool?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So let's consider the first assumption. If God is all powerful, he can create any world that he wants. Well, this assumption I don't think is necessarily true, given free will. Since it's possible that humankind does have free will, it would automatically limit the type of world that God could create or would create, right? If God desires, and I would argue that if God is love, as 1 John talks about, then love, being the highest ethic, requires a choice. And so I would say, and this is maybe a deeper theological discussion, I would say that in order for God to maintain his all-loving nature, he would be required to create free creatures to choose to love him. And if that's the case, which I think it is, I think that's the biblical standard, then it limits the type of world that God could create. And so it undercuts the first assumption of the skeptic's argument. All right. So let me ask this question. Does that make sense to you guys? That if God desires free creatures to choose to love him, then it limits the type of world he could create. He could create a world where everybody's just a robot, right? And there is no free will. But then I would argue that that undercuts God's all-loving nature. Show me a genuine relationship without love, and I'll show you somebody that's been coerced into loving somebody, right? Been forced to love somebody. And this is also another sidestep. That's one of my biggest problems with Calvinism. It is a deterministic, way in which God has created people. He has forced people to either be elected or not
Right.
be elected.
Yep.
So,
Agree
so that's the
100%.
first assumption. So as long as free will is possible, which I believe that it is, then it limits the type of world that God could create. And so it undercuts the skeptic's first assumption that God can just create whatever world that he wants. All right. And then the second assumption is that if God is all loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Now, what we said earlier is that God could have overriding reasons to allow the evil, pain, and suffering that we see. It could be that God, in his desire for the most number of people to come into a relationship with him freely, he would have to allow some evil to exist. And I usually, the way that I approach this, I use two examples from scripture and then a hypothetical situation. So think about Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 7. Stephen brilliantly gives the Jews a history lesson about who they are, what they've done, and they've always, opposed God, opposed God's servants. Which of the prophets did you not stone, right? And so he calls them stiff-necked and uncircumcised people of the heart. So he gets stoned, right? And so in Acts chapter 8, upon Stephen's stoning, there's a great persecution that's brought against the church by Saul of Tarsus. Now, this persecution, as Acts 8 tells us, leads to Christians being scattered in Jerusalem, to Judea, Samaria, and to other parts of the earth. Well, that corresponds perfectly with what Jesus said in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, that you're going to be my witnesses in these various places and to the end of the earth. Well, how did the church grow in the first century? Well, it wasn't because everybody was holding hands and singing Kumbaya, right? It was because of the persecution. And so God allows that persecution to take place so that his church might grow. And you could maybe even argue that we wouldn't be here today without some of that persecution taking place. And then obviously the clearest example of that would be Jesus and the cross. Crucifixion is brutal. If you've ever studied crucifixion, it makes your stomach squirm. It makes you uneasy. And so in a very real sense, because I believe Christianity is true, God took the greatest moment of evil in the crucifixion of his son, and that produced salvation for those who would call on the name of the Lord, who would repent and be baptized for the remission of their sins. And so it's not illogical that would be the case with Christianity. And what's interesting is when we talk about the existence of God and suffering, it's not the case that they are incompatible. On the Christian worldview, it's to be expected, right? I mean, James chapter 1, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. Why? Because it produces something in all of us. And even if we're not looking at this from a strict theological standpoint, how many people do we see in the arena of sports who say, if I hadn't undergone this suffering as a kid living in the inner city, or if I hadn't undergone this particular piece of suffering and trial, I would have never become the person and the athlete that I am. And so even just on a basic human level, I mean, I don't know if you guys watch the UFC. You guys have heard of Francis Ngannou?
Yeah.
I mean, the dude was at 10 years old, was working in a salt mine.
Yeah, that dude's unreal.
And right now he's the heavyweight champion of the world. And he says, what prepared me for this, and what makes me appreciate this, and what keeps me focused and what keeps me determined, is the fact that I worked in a salt mine. And so that's clear case of, man, this dude underwent some extreme suffering as a young man, but it produced in him what he is today, which is one, a really humble dude, and two, a knockout artist, right? I mean, he's like the Tyson of the UFC.
Dude, that guy's
You didn't think you were going to
scary.
get that on your podcast, but there you go.
Hey, I love it, man. I'm a huge UFC fan. He is scary for sure. I would
Yeah.
not want to stand next to him if he's in a bad mood.
Right. Would never want to take a liver shot from him. My body would probably shut down. And so when we look at these two hidden assumptions, we see that as we think about them more clearly, we see that these two assumptions are not logically incompatible. As long as it's possible that these things are the case, then it seems that the logical problem of evil is undercut, and that God and suffering can be compatible so long as God has moral reasons for allowing the evil, pain, and suffering. One last piece to that. It could be that God, in his knowledge, knows that for the maximal amount of people to come into a free relationship with him, that there are just some people who are not going to come into a relationship with him without suffering. I mean, how many people in your own experiences have you encountered who said, I found God when I was at rock bottom. It wasn't until I hit the absolute bottom that I cared more about my kids, my marriage, and then what saved all that was God. I mean, that's a possibility. I mean, even look, once again, another example from scripture, look at Paul. Paul didn't fully appreciate or didn't fully understand who this Jesus guy was, what he was about, persecuted the church. And then he goes on later and says, listen, I did this out of ignorance, and God, spared me out of mercy. 1 Timothy chapter 2, 1 Timothy, chapter 1. I think it's 1 Timothy, 1 or 2 Timothy, y'all can check me on it, where he talks about how he's an insolent aggressor against the church, a blasphemer against the church, he goes on, he says he's the chief of sinners. And it's not until he fully realizes that with the Damascus Road experience that he then says, oh man, I'm wrong here. Right. And so that's perfectly logical. That's perfectly coherent, that for some people, look at Israel in the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
How many times was Israel brought back into a relationship with God because God allowed them to suffer? There you go.
Yeah.
So one last piece to this, and then we can move on. Another logical or another answer to this logical problem of evil is that it is possible that God could not have created another world with as much good in it, but less evil than this world. And God has good reasons for permitting that evil to exist. So let me explain this. So once again, given human freedom, this world that we experience may be the only possible world in which God could have created to ensure that the maximal number of people are saved. And so if this is true, it shows that God and evil can also coexist.
Yeah. Yeah. See,
Y'all's thoughts?
well, okay. So here's where I think a lot of people run into the problem, right? Is because you said this a lot. It's all logical. Like all this kind of adds up logically. I think the problem that a lot of people run into is evil and suffering are really far from the logical portion of what a lot of people go through. Evil and suffering and pain and all that thing is a very emotional thing. And I think a lot of times when you go through life, it's really hard to add the logical and the emotional and kind of separate the two, because I think a lot of people would tell you when you're going through that, at least when you're going through a really tough road of suffering or that first initial shock, it's really hard to think through those type of situations logically and not emotionally. I think the other problem that people run into is I think a lot of times what Christians say can get sometimes misrepresented. The idea that kind of the idea that you presented, Dean, is we're not saying that all suffering is good. We're not saying that all evil is a good thing. We're just saying that there is a rational way of explaining why evil and God can both coexist, so to speak. Like it's not, and because I think a lot of times is
Right.
that'll get misrepresented as, well, you just think that all suffering is supposed to be good for people because you're a Christian, and that makes you incredibly insensitive. And now I'm trying to discredit you because you're not
Yeah.
taking my emotions or feelings or whatever into consideration. And I think that it's important to kind of separate those two, right? It's like, no, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of evil that exists that's pointless. But it doesn't mean that evil and God cannot coexist with each other.
So this is how I would answer that question, because I get asked by students about this a lot. It's not that I enjoy the cancer.
Right.
It's not that if I fall down and break my leg going down steps, that I just get to my 1 foot and say, "Woohoo! I broke my leg. I'm so thankful that I did that." Um, it's not the specific thing that I am suffering.
Right.
I take joy, and I think this is what James means. I take joy um, in what this is going to produce in me.
Yeah.
Not what has happened to me, but what's going to be produced in me. Um, so long as I understand that even in this trial that I might not be aware of it, but God is in some way, shape, or form working to develop me. In James, he uses this word perfection in James chapter 1, and that word there is teleos, and that word means to experience or to have a designed end, right? So this suffering that I'm going through is God is using that to develop me to meet my designed end in some way, shape, or form. And here's the thing that I would say about suffering is, oftentimes if I try and figure out what's going on in suffering, I'm never going to get my answer. I believe that we see the fruit of what's been produced in us through a suffering after we've come out the other side, and as we look back on it. That's just me. Because when we're suffering, I don't know that a lot of people focus on, okay, what's been enhanced in my spiritual walk right now, right? It's only after that, a lot of the times that we see that it's retroactive, in which we see how God has manifested
Right.
our development in suffering. So I think that's a good point. We're not saying that we should that we should throw a party every time that we suffer.
Right.
But it's not what we're going through. We're not taking joy in what we're going through. It's what God's moving us towards in our own development. So good point.
Yeah, I think that to Nathan's point, there's a difference between approaching something logically, like we said, versus the ideal that people have for what life should be in their minds. And I think more on the philosophical, academic level scale, more and more people, and this is true of a lot of philosophers, are coming around to saying suffering and pain is an intricate part of life. It's part of the human experience, and we may not like it, but it's part of it, and we may have different reasons as to why that happens, but it's just part of it. But we live in a world that says you should be happy all the time, and if anything bad happens to you, then it's because the angry man in the clouds is against you. And that's not true either. So
which is incredibly similar, and also still it's like it's far away and also incredibly similar to like Old Testament thinking, right? That because something bad was happening to you, it's because you did something bad.
Yeah.
Like it was a direct punishment thing. So it's almost like going back around to where we were, back in the days of Job.
Yeah. And here's what I would say to other people, just as and especially preachers, campus ministers, youth ministers, anybody that's consoling somebody with suffering. The last thing that you want to do is throw out a syllogism to them.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't need to do that. But something that can help us navigate this emotional problem is we need to understand, and we need to, as best as we can, help people understand that even though I'm suffering, God is not idle, right? It's not like he's just observing my suffering and just saying, "Oh, well, that stinks for you," right? No, I mean, in a very real way, as we see in the Gospels, he enters into and shares inner suffering. This is what theistic philosopher Alvin Plantinga said. He said, "He, Christ, endures the anguish of seeing, he, God, endures the anguish of seeing his Son, the second person of the Trinity, co-signed to the bitterly cruel and shameful death of the cross. He was prepared to accept this suffering in order to overcome sin and death and the evils that afflict our world, and to confer on us a life more glorious than we can imagine." So, in relation to our suffering, God's not absent, because God knows what it's like to see his own Son suffer. And think about all the things that Jesus went through on this earth. I mean, he knows what it's like to be rejected, to be mocked, to be doubted, to be deserted, to be isolated. He knows what it's like to be in hunger, in need. He knows what it's like to be scourged, flogged, stripped naked, humiliated, tortured, hung on a Roman cross. I mean, if there's anybody in the course of human history that can relate to the various types of suffering that we've gone through, I mean, he knows what it's like to lose a friend. I mean, he was at Lazarus' tomb and he wept, right? And so he knows all of those things. He knows what those experiences are like. And because he sits at the right hand of God, because he is God, then he can, in a very real way, relate to what we're going through. And I just find that personally as an amazing comfort in times of suffering. And so what we need to do when people suffer is we also need to relay that message to people.
For sure.
So obviously there's this big difference between the logical side of it, but also the emotional side of it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
for sure.
I'd like to make one more point and then we can move on to the next piece, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
What the Christian needs to also do, the Christian doesn't need to let the atheist off the hook when it comes to the problem of evil, because whether we know this or not, or whether we think about this or not, every single worldview has to deal with the problem of evil. Every single one of them does. And so oftentimes what happens is we take these questions from atheists about evil, pain, and suffering, and we're so busy trying to look for all these answers to the logical problem, to the emotional problem. Why does this happen? Why does that happen? What about this in the Old Testament? What about this in the New Testament? And we don't stop and we just say, we don't stop and just ask the atheist, well, how does your worldview deal with evil, pain, and suffering? I mean, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because when you think about it, when we look at the most common stream of atheism, which would be naturalism, there's some problems there too, right? Has anybody ever seen, on a safari, the lion that kills the zebra, and the lion says, "Mr. Zebra, I am so sorry, for the suffering that you're about to endure. I just want to let you know that other zebras will be there to console, your family for their loss." No, that doesn't happen in the natural world. This is a good quote from Richard Dawkins, actually. It's from River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life. And this is what he says. On the contrary, if the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies like the crashing of this bus are exactly what we should expect. Such a universe would be neither, watch this, evil nor good in intention. Some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it. nor any justice. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, what's so interesting about that is elsewhere, Dawkins talks about the atrocities committed by religious people. And he says, I have deliberately refrained from detailing the horrors of the Crusades, the conquistadors, or the Spanish Inquisition. Cruel and evil people can be found in every century and of every persuasion. Now, notice this. Dawkins affirms these moral terms such as evil and cruel. And the question is, on what basis does he make such a moral value judgment, right? He just said, there is no evil, right? Nor good intention. Some people get lucky, some people don't, and that's just the way it is. But then later, when he's critiquing religion, he goes, "Oh, well, evil and bad people have existed throughout the centuries." Now, watch this. Now, given his commitment to naturalism, what he just said, DNA neither cares or knows, and we just dance to it. Why weren't the conquistadors or the Crusaders or the Inquisitors of Spain simply dancing to their DNA? Right. In the same way that Dawkins, would probably consider a lion. He would not consider a lion morally evil for killing, the baby antelope on the plains of the Serengeti. So why make a moral judgment about any action? Right. Since on naturalism, there really is no good or evil. And I think that what we need to do as Christians is when we hear about the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, even before we answer the question, we need to go ahead and say, okay, how does atheism answer that? And more specifically, if you're a naturalist and you take the route that Dawkins takes, and I have found that to be exceedingly helpful because one time I wrote a question into a debate show, and a gentleman was talking about the atrocities of Christianity. And he said, well, it wasn't too long ago where Christians thought it was okay to stone people who were homosexual or burn people who were homosexual at the stake. And so I wrote in a comment and I said, so let's just say God doesn't exist, which is his worldview, if morality is just a matter of opinion, or if we're simply dancing to our own DNA, then why would it be wrong to stone gay people if it's just, a relative preference, like right. choosing ice cream? Like one right. person's chocolate is another person's vanilla. So sorry, I get pretty excited about talking to atheists about the problem of evil.
No, I get it for sure. Really good thoughts. We are going to move on though, because he mentions another one. This is so I like the problem of evil and suffering. This one I also thought was kind of interesting. The fifth reason that he gets for why he does not believe in God anymore is he mentions that intelligent design is not so intelligent, that there is no such thing as intelligent design, that if God existed, why wouldn't he have made things better, basically. And he rattles off this statistic that 99% of the species that have ever existed in the world are now currently extinct, which I thought was really interesting. So I had to go do a lot of searching on that. And that's a pretty, from the scientific community, that's a pretty unanimous consensus on that statistic. So like PBS, Scientific America, Discovery. I looked up the some journal of science. I can't remember the name of it now. But most of them would all say that, yeah, over the course of time, which depending on which reference you look at, could be anywhere from 300 to 400 million/billion years ago, however long. They've all kind of agreed that 99% of species that existed are now extinct, and so that would be a point to why there is no such thing as intelligent design. That if God were to design everything, he would have done it better. Which again, I think kind of goes back to Joshua's point that he made earlier, that who gets to define what better is, right? So, like, maybe the most intelligent design was what was created, and everything that's happened as a result of the fall of man is the reason that I think that's where my mind immediately wanted to go, was, maybe everything was created for the ideal world that God created initially, and then once the fall of man happened, everything changed after that, right? But again, it goes back to Joshua's point that, like, we've got this ideal world or end point in our head, that might not match up with what is reality, right? So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I want to give Joshua a chance to speak since I've, been flapping my gums for a while.
You're good, man. You're good.
So
I think it's interesting though I hate the way he phrases it, and I'm a stickler for words. Like my background is in languages and things like that. So
words mean things.
They do, and my thing is, and his little wordplay, intelligent design isn't so intelligent. It could not be more intelligent. The intricacies of nature and the universe are so fine-tuned, and I know Dean is just chomping at the bit to talk about this, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say, but it's so fine-tuned that were it any more or less in any given realm of whatever you want to talk about, that it would be catastrophically different. So I'm going to let Dean take the reins on this, because obviously he's more qualified to talk on it than I am, but I really don't think, of the arguments he's given, I don't think this is a strong one.
Yeah, well, I want to say something real quick before I'm going to cut Dean off before he even starts, because I want to point this out, because I think a lot of this, because I got my brain got to thinking about this. I'm like, okay, so where do they come up with this 99% number? I was never really able to find that, but I found multiple, I guess, formulas, I guess you would say. And multiple times this kind of equation came up where they're estimating that 10% of species are lost every million years, 30% are lost every 10 million years, and 65% of species are lost every 100 million years. And that all is dictated based on what you believe, or how old you believe the Earth to be, right? So if you don't believe the Earth is 100 million years old, you can't get to that 65% number. And by the way, every single one of these articles that I looked up and kind of read through, every single one of them says that extinction is expected in a total normal part of life, which, if it's designed intelligently, right, whether it's from a formalistic standpoint or down to the individual, whatever we're talking about, it's funny how intelligent design can't be intelligent, but extinction can also be normal. I don't know, that just is one of those things. Every single one of them will, of course, a lot of what I read was referencing through the process of evolution, but every single one of them said that extinction would be something that you would expect just to happen naturally in the world, which I thought was interesting, almost as if it was designed that way. But anyway, so yeah, I'll let Dean go now, because I just thought that was kind of interesting. That's
So I would say this: if this gentleman were across the table from me and we were talking, and he said, well, intelligent design isn't so intelligent. Well, right. This is where I think the atheist makes the mistake of assuming that because something is intelligently designed, it's perfectly designed, where it could just be optimally designed, right? Optimal for the purpose that the designer has for that particular thing, right? It's reason why we don't put jet engines on Corvettes, right?
We should.
Why don't we do that? Well, there might be a way to put a small jet engine, on the back of the Corvette, and we say, well, man, we can make this thing go 1,000 miles an hour, but there's trade-offs always in design, right? One of the things that is often talked about is, the difference between the human eye and the octopus eye. Well, they say, the octopus eye is better than the human eye, and if the intelligent designer was,
right.
smart, he would have given us this particular type of eye. Well, the habitats of those species are different. And so what we want to ask the atheist is we want to say, okay, well, number one, where in the text of Scripture does it say that everything is perfectly designed?
Mm.
Couldn't it just be optimally designed given the purpose for why it's been designed, right? So God says everything is very good in Scripture. All right. And so why is it illogical to think that God would create a world in which, in order to sustain the world, there would be ecosystems and cycles of flourishing and extinction based upon the actions and the adaptability of species? I don't understand why that would be a problem. And so make sure that when you're talking with your atheist friends, and this is what I say to Jesus, what's his name? Jesus Unfollower?
Yeah, Jesus Unfollower.
Yeah. I would say, okay, well, where does it say in Scripture that everything was perfectly designed? And you're mistaking perfect design for optimal design. There's always going to be trade-offs in design. I mean, think about all of the muscle cars that are out there. Well, I remember the Dodge Viper had like 500, horsepower. So what's the trade-off there? This has been designed to be a muscle car to go really fast. Well, what's compromised in that design? Well, gas mileage.
Yeah.
Right? It's not going to go 35 or 40 miles to the gallon, right? But one might say, well, why is that? Then that means the designers of the, Viper GT in Dodge, well, they're just horrible designers. Well, no, they're not, because they've designed the car to fit the purpose that they have for that particular thing, right? If you want something that goes 30 or 40 miles to the gallon, you get a Honda CRV, right? Well, what's the trade-off with the Honda CRV? You're not going to get 500 miles an hour horsepower out of the Honda CRV, but you're going to get like 35, 40 miles to the gallon.
Mhm.
It all comes back to what's the optimal design that the designer has for particular things. And so, for instance, humans, we could say, yeah, I might wish that I could fly. Well, we don't have that capability, right? And so what would I have to compromise? Here's the question. What would I have to compromise in my own bodily structure in order to fly? And how would that negatively impact me? Okay. And so once again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but this is where the atheist simply confuses perfect design for optimal design. And I think optimal design can fit right into that phrase, and everything was very good.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I'm a words guy and a language guy. So the problem with traditional Christian approaches to creation in Genesis 1 is we have equated, like Dean said, the word perfect with the word good. The Hebrew word is tov, just good is a good translation. There is another Hebrew word for perfect. It's the word tamim, and that doesn't occur in Genesis 1. And I'm not saying that God created something to be bad, but I really like the argument of creation being optimal. It goes back to what we talked about earlier with the problem of pain and suffering. If Adam and Eve were in the garden and they were chasing after some animal or whatever, and they tripped and fell and scraped their knee, did they feel the pain of the knee scrape in the garden? Well, sure they did. So people, and this is an issue too for Christians. They say, well, there was no pain in the garden. Well, is that possible? Could you possibly have that? So it's not so much to me an issue of is there or isn't there. It's purpose, and can we say that pain has a purpose? But here with the issue of the creative design and intelligent design, God knew what He was doing, and the power of the spoken word brought that into existence. Another thing, I don't know if y'all want to get into this or not, but more and more systematic theology textbooks are arguing for an old earth. And that, I think, is going to make a very interesting argument for apologetics. Okay, so it's going to be something that we have to deal with for a long time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's really interesting the number of people that you kind of run into back and forth that will try to explain that side of it one way or the other. The Earth's dating and all of that good stuff. But yeah, I think you guys are both obviously. I say that I don't want this to sound like an echo chamber or anything. Josh and I keep talking about how eventually we're going to have somebody on that just disagrees with everything that we say. But yeah, the idea that perfect and optimal, that trying to make a difference there for sure. Anything else before we go to the next one?
Go on.
No, all right, let's go then. This one, we'll spend as much time here as you guys want to, but I'm going to encourage people. So the sixth reason out of 7. So you guys hang on. We're getting to the end of this list, right? The sixth reason that he says is that the Bible, it's just not reliable. He said, would the Bible not be more reliable if the Gospels were written in Jesus' lifetime? And I know how bad Joshua wants to talk about this one. But I will say, before we talk about this one, get to the end of this podcast or this video or whatever, however you're watching it. Once you finish this one, go back and look at episode 4. Joshua and I sat down with Doug Burleson, and this is like his whole world. He's got a doctorate in this realm of biblical authenticity, basically, and why the Gospels can be trusted in when and how they were written. So go back and watch that one. It's episode 4, I believe. It's called The Gospels. So just a shameless selfish plug on that one if you want to get into that. But Joshua, I know you're chomping at the bit to say something about this. The Bible just isn't reliable, and interestingly enough, right, up until this point, I know we've referenced scripture here and there, but up to this point, one of the things that I love about the Daily Apologist specifically is when you're talking about an atheist and the existence of God, one of the last places you really need to go to is the Bible, right? Because they don't credit that anyway as being any sort of reliable method of measurement.
Yeah.
And so now he's brought this idea that, I think these last 2 are just kind of like, oh, here's my 7 to tack on. I don't know if he went with 7 specifically as like a little, like a hidden jab there, like 7 being that perfect number of reasons that he doesn't believe in God or what. But I do find it interesting that he brought up the Bible, which again, most, if not all atheists will discredit it as being any sort of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, any sort of viable or useful term to measure anything, basically.
Yeah, well, a big problem that we have to face as a apologist, if I want to use that term loosely, it is more and more is being written from an atheist perspective on the popular level. And it's being written by scholars who are making and presenting these things on the popular level. So for my work and what I do, and I work in, the ancient manuscripts and original languages on a very frequent basis. And people like Bart Ehrman, he's one of the leading, we talked about him in episode 4 quite a bit, so I won't talk about him a lot here, but he is a bona fide scholar. He's a textual critic in the New Testament, and he will say that there are more variants among New Testament manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's true. And that sounds like a lot. We have 5,800 manuscripts at least. And more
get them, Josh. Get them.
Hey, I'm telling you, more and more are being discovered every day. And no 2 agree completely. It may be a difference in spelling. And the problem is most of those variants are simple blunders or completely unviable readings because you didn't have a printing press. People are copying by hands, and people make mistakes. So, is Matthew's name spelled with the letter tau theta, or is it just theta, or is it tau theta? It's Matthew, but it is a textual variant.
Are we talking Greek or social clubs? What are we doing?
Yeah, for real.
That's what I know.
I'm a matter of tau theta.
Yeah. But the thing about it is that's a mistake, and it counts, but no one cares about it because it doesn't change the meaning of the text. We do have
Right.
5,800 Greek manuscripts, at least. More and more being discovered. The Hebrew manuscripts are so intricately copied. There are problems with the Hebrew manuscripts, but thankfully we have the Greek Septuagint to help us. We have the Syriac Peshitta and all kinds of other resources to help us figure out the wording of the text. Yeah, I could talk about this all day long.
Right. Well, one of the things I wanted to follow up on is it's funny because at the end of the day, two things I think are interesting. In the appendix of Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman says that these textual variants don't undercut any core doctrines of Christianity, which I find to be interesting.
Yes.
And then two, that's not even the reason why Ehrman stopped believing.
No.
He stopped believing because of the problem of evil.
Yes.
Yeah.
And suffering. So I find that to be interesting. Not saying that because of that we should discredit some of the points that Ehrman raises.
Right.
But I guess my question would be, anytime we have a conversation with somebody and say, well, these things are just unreliable, we need to ask the question first, okay, well, what do you mean by reliable?
Right.
And what is your standard for accepting a historical document as reliable?
Right.
That's what we need to do. Sometimes we get into these conversations and someone says, well, that's not reliable. And we just start spouting off all of these pieces of information. What I want to do is I would just want to sit back real quick and ask really good questions. Like, what do you mean by reliable? And how would a document fit into that definition?
Right.
So William Lane Craig has a really good way of discussing this. He says, as far as reliable goes, look at the time difference between the event and the source that records the event. So, for example, everything we know about Alexander the Great came 400 years after Alexander the Great lived. Okay, that's in the grand scheme of history, that's pretty close to the event. And, it makes for a reliable source in a lot of ways. The Gospels are recorded within 30 to 50 years of the event of Jesus's life, ministry, death, and resurrection. So if I'm going to trust an ancient source that talks about Alexander the Great from 400 years difference, why would I not trust a document that's so much closer to the events of the life of Jesus? And maybe part of that is because it records miraculous things and it's religiously charged in some ways. And I can understand having to get around some of those issues. But he makes the point, like, why wasn't it written during the lifetime of Jesus?
Yeah.
Well, it's pretty doggone close.
Yeah.
At least the autographs,
Well, so here's the thing.
Right.
I think that there's an underlying problem there on both camps, right? So I think Christians do this, and I think atheists do this too. And Joshua, you kind of alluded to it when you were talking about how he was a bona fide scholar. What we accept and what we don't oftentimes boils down to, well, because quite frankly, somebody smarter than me said so. And I think that's kind of the realm that we play in, right? Dean, you were talking about, well, what makes something reliable? It's like, well, because Dawkins said it was reliable, or because Craig said it was reliable, or whoever said, this is the argument they used, and they know way more about this stuff than you or I do, therefore they're correct. And I think, don't get me wrong, I think Christians and atheists both play in that realm. I think a lot of Christians will go, well, Doug Burleson said, or, Kyle Butt said, or, whoever else that's, way on up the list of
well, the old adage was back in the day is that the Catholics have their popes and the church has their editors. Right.
I like that.
And so, yeah. So, the other point that I would just piggyback off of what Joshua said is that we need to make sure that we're not talking about the event or the time of the event was recorded and today. It's the time of the event and when that event was recorded. Because some people, some of the atheist popularizers will be, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but a little sloppy in their critique, and they'll say, well, you can't trust that. It's written 2,000 years ago. And so then I would ask the question, well, do you apply that to everything that was written 2,000 years ago? Between 2,000 years ago and now, anything that dates between now or anything that dates to 2,000 years ago, you just categorically deny that those things are historical. Well, if you're going to dismiss it for 2,000 years, well, what about 1,000 years? Well, what about 500 years? Right? Well, like, where do you stop, on that? And so I think that's a very good point that Joshua makes. Not a whole lot of Alexander the Great skeptics out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike Licona and Bart Ehrman had a debate. I don't know how long ago this was, but it couldn't have been too terribly long ago, debating the historical reliability of the Gospels. And Mike makes a really good point. He said, we have to judge them based on the criteria of what a historical document would have been in that time. Because Ehrman says, well, they don't write in chronological order and they're sloppy and they just, throw a bunch of stories together, just try to string along some theological thing. Well, when you go back and look at ancient historical documents that record history, that's exactly what they do. It's very frustrating because they rarely are writing chronological order, and it's really frustrating to study.
Yeah, it makes doctorate students like yourself just have headaches all day, doesn't it?
Yeah, I keep Tylenol in every pocket and drawer of my desk.
Good deal. Well, and so I think going along with both those points, kind of what Dean said, you're talking about, at what point do you draw that cutoff? I think the problem that, again, I think both sides have this particular problem is I think you make up your mind and then you look for sources to verify that, right? I think that's kind of the big problem that a lot of people have, and you don't have the same criteria, like you said, for every historical document that comes along. But yeah, for more on that, for more on Bart Ehrman and the cohesiveness of all the Gospels and their reliability, go watch episode 4 of this particular podcast. Do a whole lot of talking about that, and then we're going to get to here point number 7. Finally, after 2 parts, we finally got into part number 7, which is the first time that he mentions the S word, and that is science. He says that science is why he no longer believes in God, that the God of the gaps is shrinking. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with that term, God of the gaps, basically, I'm going to oversimplify this. I'm going to let Dean give the really academic response. Basically, 100 years ago, when science would look at something and go, I just can't figure this out, they would attribute it to God. Like it had to have some higher cause than what we're able to see. And his argument is that as over the last 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, whatever, science is catching up to the point where a lot of these quote unquote scientific mysteries are now being explained. We don't have to attribute certain undiscovered phenomenon to a higher power. We just have to wait for the science to catch up to us. This one is my personal least favorite because it implies, in my opinion, that Christians cannot believe both their Christian faith as well as science, which is the biggest reason that I was a huge fan, and now I'm no longer a fan of Bill Nye the Science Guy. We mentioned him, I think, very early on in the first part. I loved Bill Nye the Science Guy, and then he eventually got to the point where he was like, look, if you don't believe in science and you're going to be a Christian, you're stupid. That was basically what he got. He stupid, ignorant, whatever the case may be. And I think that there's a very distinct line that you draw that Christians cannot be Christians and believe in science, which I think is interesting because I think most rational atheists would say that Christians pick and choose the science that they agree with from an atheistic argument, right? I've never met a Christian that did not believe in science from a biological perspective, like the idea of male, female. I completely believe that chlorophyll, right, exists in green leafy plants. The mitochondrion is the powerhouse of the cell, right? Like nobody argues that sort of stuff. It's only when it comes to the idea of, when we start talking about explanations for why things exist, then all of a sudden it's like, well, you just don't believe in science. And there's, like I said, there's so many different ways to go about that. But yeah, that's the idea of the God of the gaps and why I personally really dislike that argument in particular.
And I think you've nailed it. I think that's exactly what the God of the gaps is where there's a lack of scientific knowledge. Oftentimes people will fill that gap in with God. So for instance, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, when there were earthquakes, people used to say, "Oh, well, the gods are mad." Right. Well, now that we know about plate tectonics, we don't need to ascribe that to God. Or, when it, lightninged and thundered and rained, they'd say, well, the gods are crying. Well, now that we know about water cycles, we no longer need that explanation. But what's so interesting about this is that this is a double-edged sword. Yeah, sure, the God of the gaps isn't a great way to approach science, but neither is naturalism of the gaps, right? Uh, insert, problem here. And we say, okay, well, the universe must have had a beginning based upon the evidence. And they say, oh, well, the universe could be infinitely old. And, we may think that science will reveal that at some point, just not right now. Well, that's naturalism of the gaps. Or what about, miracles in the Old Testament or the New Testament, where people look at those and they say, well, those things don't happen anymore. Okay, well, what about this miracle right here? Well, so for instance, in resurrection debates, what you'll often do is you'll press the atheist and say, okay, well, what would happen if, and this is what Mike Licona used against Matt Dillahunty in their debate about the resurrection, which I've tactically acquired from Mike Licona, is, okay, let's say we're sitting in the auditorium and a terrorist comes in and he cuts my head off and everybody sees it. Everybody leaves the building, and then 5 minutes later, I walk out. My head's attached, and I got scars on my neck. Would you say that a miracle occurred? And what you will most often get is, well, I wouldn't say there was a miracle. There may be something that has taken place naturally that we need to investigate. Well, that's naturalism of the gaps right there.
Yeah.
I can't explain this, but maybe it's something in nature would have to have caused that. So naturalism of the gaps is just as prevalent amongst atheists as God of the gaps is amongst theists. And so the other point that I would make is this, and I know it's a TikTok video, but I'd like some more clarification. Where has so as theists, as Christians, we believe that God created the universe, that the universe is not infinitely old, but it has a beginning, a finite time ago. And all of the research shows that that's the case. And here's the thing, I can even take an Acts 17 approach and enter into the atheist world and show the atheist that this is the case. Let's just say I'm talking to Jesus unfollower, and I say, okay, well, do you accept the Big Bang? And he says, yeah, I accept the Big Bang. I can look him right in the face and say, for the sake of this conversation, I'll go ahead and agree with you that the Big Bang's true, right? I'm not affirming it. I'm just saying, hey, for this specific conversation, I'll affirm it. I'll meet you where you are, and I will show you that all of the scientific research shows that from 1920s all the way up to now that the Big Bang is true, that a finite time ago the universe came into existence. Well, what does he do with that? Well, okay. Well, even if you have a Big Bang, all right, well, that still requires a cause. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. So you can show the atheist, whatever begins to exist has a cause. You believe the universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. Now, notice I haven't outrightly affirmed his position. I've entered into his position to show him that even if I take his position, it requires a first cause.
Yeah.
Even for him to hold his position. And so I think that approach is a way to meet some of these people where they are. And so I would just ask Jesus unfollower, what model of universal origins does he take? Does he hold the Big Bang model, or does he hold some type of model that shows that the universe is eternal? And let's have a conversation about it.
Interestingly enough, I actually watched a couple of debates debate/conversations of a popular YouTube atheist, and more and more this idea is popping up, at least that I've noticed, that people that atheists that hold to the Big Bang will say that something existed, right? That the universe had that finite start, but that whatever it started from did exist beforehand and could potentially be infinite, but it's not God, right? It was something that was just there, kind of naturally, as you would put it, Dean. But it just kind of happened in and of itself in that particular environment, which to me, I don't know if comical is not the right word. I just think it's really, really interesting that I've heard that argument more, that something existed infinitely that had that start, but it wasn't God. So you've got to explain what that infinite thing was that isn't God. Interestingly enough, too, I think that, and this may be a little bit off the course of what he had in mind. Interestingly enough, to me, we don't ever acknowledge some of the things that science has gone on to proven that were recorded in the Bible, such as cleaning practices, food storage practices that were all given to the Israelites, I think in Exodus or Leviticus, about what kind of plates they could keep and what kind of plates they could destroy, how they would quarantine dead bodies. And we learn now, okay, yeah, this is what you need to do with the dead corpse because of bacteria and so on and so forth. And you're like, well, they had it right, in Exodus when God was giving them instructions on how they were supposed to do this, but and science proved that to be correct. And again, I'm not suggesting that we use the Bible as a science textbook. Okay, please don't take that from what I'm saying. I just find it kind of interesting that there are things that science has gone on to prove to be correct that were recorded first in Scripture, which I think is interesting. And I don't know how an atheist would address that, if they would say, well, that was a practice long before Scripture was written, or how they would address that. I've never had an atheist address that one with me. So, because again, most don't credit the Bible for being anything. It was probably something that was in existence, and then the Bible just commandeered it to prove a point. But, and again,
well, I know Dean has to go, so we'll let him off as he needs. To your point, Nathan, just really quick, I would say I would encourage our Christian listeners to be very careful about trying to use the Bible as a scientific textbook.
Sure.
It's a pre-scientific book. That doesn't mean that it is scientifically inaccurate. I think that the inspiration of the Bible allows it to be scientifically accurate where scientific accuracy is necessary, but it is a pre-scientific book from an ancient perspective, and we need to keep that in mind too. Okay. So, I know Dean has to go, but we really appreciate him being on and all of his time that he's given to these videos.
Yeah, Dean is busy.
I definitely appreciate you guys inviting me on, allowing me to, talk about these, very important subjects. And it's just another reason why we need, we need to develop more Christian apologists, and we need to have more Christians engaging in this type of social media effort, because that's just where everybody is right now. That's where the youngest generations are. That's where the millennials are. And I appreciate the job that you guys are doing and the service that you're providing for the church with your podcast. I've watched a couple of episodes, and it's really good. And so I appreciate you guys inviting me on. And as they've said before, anybody has any questions, they can email us at thedailyapologist@gmail.com. And we're all over social media, whatever social media stuff you have, it's just at The Daily Apologist.
There you go. Check the description for in both parts. I'll have the links for The Daily Apologist in the descriptions of both these videos. If you're ever in the West or Middle Tennessee areas, please stop by and see myself or Joshua. If you ever venture out to Blacksburg, Virginia, I know Dean would love to sit and have a conversation with you. Again, you can check him out and all of the great stuff that the Daily Apologist is putting out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Is Twitter a thing anymore? Is that still a thing that's going? I'm old.
It's a vortex.
I'm old. I don't keep up with all that stuff. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you stayed with us to this point, again, 2-parter videos are always kind of fun for us. Dean, thank you again one more time so much for being on and volunteering your time, guys. We will see you again next time. If you've got a video that you want us to address specifically, by all means, reach out to myself or Joshua. We'll put it on the queue for sure. Thanks, guys.